What became of the billions of dollars worth of art that Adolf Hitler hoarded during his reign of terror? Where are the masterpieces that the Nazis systematically looted from Jewish families, museums, and private collections across conquered Europe? And why, nearly 80 years after the war's end, are thousands of stolen artworks still missing? The fate of Hitler's vast art empire is one of history's most complex treasure hunts. A labyrinth of theft, recovery, restitution, and controversy that continues to shake the art world today. This is not just a story about paintings gathering dust in forgotten bunkers. It is a tale of obsession, cultural genocide, underground networks, and legal battles that rage on in courtrooms from New York to Vienna. Hitler fancied himself an artist, a frustrated painter who had been rejected twice from the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. That rejection festered into a toxic obsession. Once in power, he did not just want to collect art, he wanted to reshape the entire cultural landscape of Europe according to his twisted ideology. His grand vision was the Führer Museum in Linz, Austria, his childhood hometown. This was not going to be just another museum. Hitler envisioned a colossal cultural complex that would dwarf the Louvre, the Uffizi, and every other museum in existence. It would house the greatest collection of Germanic and classical art ever assembled, proving once and for all the supposed superiority of Aryan culture. To stock his fantasy museum, Hitler and his henchmen, particularly Hermann Goering and Alfred Rosenberg, unleashed a systematic plundering operation unprecedented in human history. The Nazis did not just steal art opportunistically. They industrialized theft with bureaucratic efficiency that would have impressed any corporate logistics department. Here's what most people do not realize. The Nazi art looting operation had divisions, departments, and special task forces. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, known as the ERR, was specifically created to confiscate what they cynically called ownerless Jewish property, a euphemism for stealing from families who had been murdered or forced to flee. They did not just grab paintings off walls. They cataloged, photographed, and systematically documented their theft with meticulous German precision. The numbers are staggering. Researchers estimate the Nazis looted approximately 1/5 of all art in Europe, somewhere between 600,000 and 650,000 artworks. That does not count the countless religious artifacts, tapestries, sculptures, rare books, and cultural treasures that disappeared into the Nazi machine. Think about that for a moment. 1 in every 5 artworks across an entire continent was stolen in just 12 years. Goering, Hitler's corpulent second-in-command, was perhaps even more voracious. His collection at his estate, Karenhall, rivaled Hitler's own ambitions. He would station himself at the Jeu de Paume Museum in occupied Paris, where confiscated art was stored and displayed. Like a grotesque king in a candy store, he would waddle through galleries pointing at masterpieces, saying, "That one for me, that one for the Führer." By war's end, Goering had amassed a personal collection of more than 1,400 pieces. But here's a chilling detail most documentaries gloss over. The Nazis created a tiered system for art. Works by Aryan artists such as Dürer, Rembrandt, and Vermeer were preserved for German collections. Degenerate art, modern works by Picasso, Kandinsky, Chagall, and any Jewish artists, was either sold abroad for foreign currency, destroyed, or used for target practice. In March 1939, Berlin firefighters burned approximately 5,000 works of modern art in the courtyard of the city's main fire station. Imagine works by Picasso and Klee literally going up in flames to feed Nazi ideology. The operation had its own bizarre economics. Art dealer Hildebrand Gerlit, whose son Cornelius would make headlines decades later, served as one of Hitler's primary art procurers. Gerlit bought degenerate art from German museums at fire sale prices, then sold it internationally at enormous markups, funneling foreign currency back to the Reich while building his own secret collection. It was a money laundering scheme wrapped in cultural destruction. As Allied bombs began raining on German cities in 1943 and 1944, the Nazis faced a logistical nightmare. How do you protect a stolen empire of priceless art? The answer lay deep underground, in places that sound like settings from an Indiana Jones film but were all too real. The ALT Musi salt mine in Austria became Hitler's primary art bunker. Located in the picturesque Austrian Alps near Salzburg, this labyrinthine mine had been excavating salt for centuries. Its vast chambers, some as large as cathedrals, maintained perfect temperature and humidity for preserving art. Nazi curators converted these chambers into climate-controlled storage galleries, complete with wooden shelving and careful organization systems. By war's end, Alta Aussie contained roughly 6,500 paintings, including masterpieces like Vermeer's The Art of Painting, Michelangelo's Madonna of Bruges, and the Ghent altarpiece, a 15th century polyptych considered one of the most important paintings in Western art history. The mine also held sculptures, furniture, tapestries, and an enormous collection of rare books and manuscripts. But Alta Aussie nearly became art's greatest tomb. In April 1945, with defeat imminent and Soviet forces approaching from the east, Gauleiter August Eigruber received orders, possibly from Hitler himself, though this remains disputed, to destroy everything rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Eigruber ordered 8 500-pound bombs to be placed deep within the mine, camouflaged as marble shipments to avoid detection. Enter the unlikely heroes, local Austrian miners who had been forced to work in the facility. These men, understanding what was at stake, staged a quiet rebellion. On May 3, 1945, just days before American forces arrived, the miners blocked the main entrance with rubble, sealing the bombs inside but making them inaccessible for detonation. When American Monuments men, the famous art historians and curators turned soldiers, arrived on May 8, 1945, they found the mine intact and its treasures saved by ordinary working men who chose preservation over destruction. The Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives program, immortalized in the 2014 film but rarely understood in its true complexity, consisted of approximately 345 men and women from 13 nations. These were not all art historians with tweed jackets and pipes. They included architects, museum directors, artists, educators, and archivists. People who understood that cultural heritage was worth fighting for even as bullets flew. Their task was overwhelming. Beyond Alta Aussie, the Nazis had hidden art in approximately 1,500 repositories across Germany, Austria, and occupied territories. Castles, monasteries, mines, tunnels, barns, and even private homes concealed stolen treasures. The Merkers salt mine in Thuringia, Germany, held not just art but also the entire gold reserves of the German Reichsbank, 100 tons of gold bars, plus millions in looted currency and personal valuables taken from concentration camp victims, including gold teeth. When General Eisenhower himself toured Merkers in April 1945, even he was stunned. The mine, located 2,000 feet underground, required a 4-minute elevator descent. What Eisenhower found shocked him. Rooms filled with currency from dozens of countries, artwork stacked floor to ceiling, and personal belongings of Holocaust victims, wedding rings, pocket watches, jewelry, all cataloged with Nazi efficiency. The Monuments men worked frantically. They would arrive at a location, often with incomplete intelligence, and have to secure, inventory, and transport thousands of objects before looters, weather, or warfare could destroy them. In many cases, they were racing against Soviet forces who had their own ideas about war reparations and showed less interest in eventual restitution to original owners. One particularly dramatic episode involved the rescue of the Ghent altarpiece, which had been moved multiple times during the war. This massive multi-panel masterpiece by Jan van Eyck had been coveted by conquerors for centuries. Napoleon had stolen it, and now Hitler wanted it as the crown jewel of his Linz collection. When Monuments men finally located it in Alta Aussie, they discovered that one panel was missing. It had been stolen in 1934 and has never been recovered, making it one of the most sought-after missing artworks in history. By 1951, the Western Allies had established central collecting points, massive warehouses where recovered art was gathered, cataloged, and theoretically prepared for return. The largest was in Munich's Führerbau, ironically one of Hitler's own administrative buildings. At its peak, the Munich collecting point held over 500,000 objects. But here is where the story gets murky, and where most people's understanding ends too soon. What happened next was not a simple fairy tale of art returned to rightful owners. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, a legal quagmire, and in many cases, a continuation of injustice. First, there was the sheer problem of provenance, determining who actually owned what. Nazi records were often deliberately vague, destroyed, or falsified. A painting might have passed through 5 hands, been sold under duress, or been traded for exit visas that meant life or death. How do you untangle that? The Allies established rules requiring claimants to prove ownership, but many Jewish families had lost everything: their homes, their documents, their very lives. Asking survivors to produce pre-war receipts for paintings was often impossible. Second, there was the Cold War. As tensions between East and West escalated, the urgency to return art diminished, while the desire to win propaganda points increased. The Soviets took an estimated 200,000 artworks back to Russia as war reparations, many of which remain there today. Russia argues these were legitimate compensation for the 27 million Soviet citizens killed, and for the massive destruction of Soviet cultural sites. The Soviet approach to captured art was dramatically different from Western restitution efforts. Stalin viewed art as tangible compensation for Soviet suffering, and Soviet trophy brigades systematically stripped museums, palaces, and private collections across occupied Eastern Germany. The Pushkin Museum and the Hermitage in Russia still hold thousands of these pieces. When Russia finally admitted in the 1990s that they possessed these treasures, international outrage erupted. But Russian law now classifies wartime acquisitions as legal spoils, making restitution nearly impossible. Third, and perhaps most troubling, was the complicity of museums, dealers, and governments in keeping stolen art. Many institutions that received recovered works simply absorbed them into their collections without rigorous investigation into wartime gaps in ownership. The Swiss art market, which remained neutral during the war, became a laundering operation for looted art, and Swiss bank secrecy laws protected both Nazi wealth and stolen cultural property. By 1951, the Allies essentially gave up on comprehensive restitution. Remaining works were transferred to the German government with the understanding that Germany would continue restitution efforts, but post-war Germany, divided and devastated, had other priorities. Thousands of works simply disappeared into museum collections, private holdings, or were sold at auction with sanitized provenances that conveniently skipped the years from 1933 to 1945. The Führer Museum, of course, was never built. The site in Linz remained empty, a monument to megalomania that thankfully never materialized. But what happened to the specific pieces designated for it reveals the chaos of post-war art distribution. Some went to Austrian museums, some to German institutions, and many languished in storage for decades. Then came the bombshells that proved this was not ancient history gathering dust in archives. In 2012, German authorities raided the Munich apartment of an elderly recluse named Cornelius Gerlet. What they found stunned the art world. 1,280 paintings, drawings, and prints, including works by Picasso, Matisse, Chagall, and Renoir, were crammed into a small apartment. These were remnants of his father Hildebrand's dealings with the Nazis, hidden for 7 decades. Cornelius Gerlet had lived surrounded by artistic masterpieces worth potentially €1 billion. He never sold them, never displayed them. He simply kept what had become a strange shrine to his father's complicated legacy. The discovery reignited debates about restitution, the statute of limitations, and the responsibility of current holders of looted art. Gurlitt died in 2014, and he bequeathed his collection to a Swiss museum. Legal battles over individual pieces continue to this day. The Gurlitt affair exposed something uncomfortable. How many other collections remained hidden? How many families had quietly held on to Nazi-era acquisitions, passing them down through generations who either did not know or did not want to know their true origins? The answer, as subsequent discoveries proved, was many. The Gurlitt case wasn't isolated. In 2015, the heirs of Jewish art dealer Paul Rosenberg won a legal battle to recover a Pissarro painting from a Spanish museum. In 2018, the Supreme Court ruled on a case involving a Klimt painting, forcing American courts to hear claims about Nazi-looted art regardless of where it currently resides. In 2021, French investigators discovered dozens of looted artworks in the personal collection of a deceased French resistance hero, proving that even heroes of the war sometimes kept spoils. Modern technology has revolutionized the hunt. The Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany maintains a database of over 600,000 items still missing. The Art Loss Register tracks stolen and looted works globally. Artificial intelligence now scans auction catalogs and museum inventories, cross-referencing against databases of looted art. In 2023, a Kandinsky watercolor was identified in a Dutch museum as having been looted from a Jewish collector, and it had hung on museum walls for decades with nobody questioning its wartime journey. Austria has been particularly aggressive in recent restitution efforts, returning over 15,000 objects since 1998. The Netherlands established a comprehensive research program investigating Dutch museum collections. Germany created a lost art database and has returned hundreds of pieces. But these are voluntary programs, and many countries still resist systematic investigation of their collections. The emotional and financial stakes remain enormous. When Austria finally returned Gustav Klimt's portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, the first to the heirs of Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer in 2006, the painting sold for $135 million, then a record. But beyond money, these restitutions represent something deeper: acknowledgement, justice, and the restoration of family legacies erased by genocide. Yet thousands of artworks remain in a legal twilight zone. Museums claim they purchased works in good faith from reputable dealers. Current owners argue that decades have passed and that disrupting settled ownership creates its own injustices. Some families have given up, lacking resources for expensive international litigation. Others have accepted compromises, sharing ownership, or accepting financial settlements rather than the art itself. Some of the most disturbing revelations have emerged from examining the role of Allied soldiers themselves. While the Monuments Men worked heroically to save art, not every soldier was so noble. American GIS looted smaller items, silverware, jewelry, and small paintings that they could easily transport home. In 2009, a former American soldier's family discovered they had been living with a stolen Dutch masterpiece for decades, hanging innocently in their living room. Perhaps most cynically, some art dealers who had collaborated with the Nazis simply rebranded themselves as victims or resistance fighters after the war. They would discover caches of artwork they had personally helped the Nazis acquire, then sell these pieces on the open market, pocketing profits twice, once from the Nazis and once from post-war buyers. Major auction houses held sales throughout the 1950s and the 1960s featuring works with suspicious provenances that nobody questioned too closely. The psychological toll on families seeking restitution is rarely discussed but profoundly significant. Imagine discovering that a painting your grandmother loved now hangs in a museum that insists they purchased it legally. You must then embark on years of legal battles, dredging up painful family histories, all while being portrayed as greedy opportunists. The re-traumatization is real and ongoing. Even when families win restitution cases, the victories are bittersweet. The recovered artwork can never resurrect murdered relatives or restore childhood shattered by persecution. It is a material fragment of a destroyed world, valuable but ultimately incapable of healing what was broken. The story of Hitler's art collection does not end, it evolves. In 2024, researchers continue discovering provenances that reveal wartime theft. Auction houses now face intense scrutiny. Museums hire provenance researchers specifically to examine their collections for gaps between 1933 and 1945. The art market has reluctantly accepted that the crimes of World War II cast shadows that do not fade with time. What makes this story endlessly fascinating is its layering of human drama. Hitler's grandiose fantasies, Göring's gluttony, the quiet heroism of Austrian miners, the determination of monuments men, the grief of survivors seeking family treasures, the moral compromises of the post-war world, and the ongoing detective work of researchers who refuse to let history be buried. The ultimate question remains haunting and unresolved. How do you make whole something that can never truly be whole? How do you return not just a painting, but everything it represented, a family's wealth, taste, history, and future that was violently erased? A Rembrandt portrait hanging in a museum might seem like just art, but to someone whose grandmother owned it before being murdered at Auschwitz, it is a ghost, a gravestone, and a last connection to an exterminated world. Hitler's art collection in the end became a diaspora, scattered across museums, private collections, government warehouses, and dusty apartments. Some pieces found their way home. Many never will. And perhaps that fractured, incomplete resolution is somehow fitting for a story born from humanity's darkest chapter, where resolution and justice remain forever partial, forever incomplete, forever marked by what was irretrievably lost.